the passage here, which we started last week talking about, is in verse 2. You shall not add to the word that I command you, nor shall you subtract from it, to observe the commandments of Hashem your God that I command you. Ramban went over Rashi's opinion on this. Rashi sort of limited his interpretation to say that this is
You hear what he said, Jerry? You didn't
adding to the number of passages that go into tefillin. For example, putting 5 into the tefillin instead of 4. And subtracting would be putting 3 passages into the tefillah instead of 4. Extra number of fringes on the tzitzis, extra number of species to wave on Sukkot would all be adding to the commandment. Ramban added his opinion, which was that also, let's say you just came up with a brand new commandment, not that you were adding constituent parts of a commandment, making it more than it was before. But even if you if you just make up a new commandment, and he uses the example in 1 Kings 12:33, Jeroboam, the king of the northern kingdom of Israel, made up a new commandment, a new holiday that he wanted people to celebrate. And you're not allowed to do that either. It would be under this commandment in Deuteronomy 4:2, that would be disallowed. And then he quotes the Talmud. He quotes Megillah 14a. He says, "This is what the sages said regarding the reading of the Megillah." He says, he actually says the wrong number, which is funny. I'll read it right from Megillah. It says, 48 prophets and 7 prophetesses prophesied on behalf of the Jewish people, and they neither subtracted from nor added on to what is written in the Torah except for the reading of Megillah. Megillah is the scroll of Esther. The scroll of Esther is read every year on Purim by observant Jews, Orthodox Jews. And they don't just, they don't just sit there and read it necessarily. They make it fun, and kids are there and they make a holiday of it. People wear costumes and whatever. They don't just sit there and read it necessarily. But this is, there's a question here, which is in the Gemara, which is, what exposition? In other words, where did they get the idea that they're allowed to do that? It seems like they're adding a commandment. But we know you're not allowed to add a commandment. Ramban doesn't quote the whole passage. I thought it was kind of interesting to see what the reasoning was. So I'll keep reading from Megillah. This is the tractate Megillah from the Talmud. So what exposition led them to believe they could add a commandment to the Torah by saying we need to read Megillah on Purim? Well, Rabbi Chia said that he heard from Rabbi Yehoshua ben Korcha, well, if from slavery to freedom we recite songs, from death to life, all the more so. What he means is, well, we recite songs of praise, the Song of the Sea and the hymns of Hallel, to recall the Exodus from Egypt. So this is done for Pesach, to recall the Exodus. There are lots of songs of praise. And that was just going from slavery to freedom. On Purim, it was kind of even, Rabbi Yehoshua thinks at least, that it's even a bigger deal because they were all going to die, and then they all got to live because Haman was going to kill all of the Jews in the Persian Empire, and their lives were saved. So that's Rabbi Yehoshua's reasoning. That's why it's so we instituted a rule that we sing Hallel. Do you recall the Exodus on the holidays? So we can institute a reading of this story to celebrate going from death to life on Purim. A response, this is an unnamed responder. There's several unnamed interlocutors here. So that the response to that was, well, if so, we should recite Hallel on Purim. Like if we're going to be consistent, if Hallel is what we do to celebrate these things, we'll recite Hallel on Purim. Hallel is a series of psalms. It's lots of psalms recited one after another. They're sung. It's fun. Well, the response to the responder is, well, Hallel is not recited in a miracle that occurred outside the land of Israel. Now think about that one for a second. Where did the Exodus happen? Did Exodus happen inside the land of Israel? No, it did not. So the response is, of course, with regard to the Exodus, which was also a miracle that occurred outside the land of Israel, how are we able to recite songs of praise? How can we recite Hallel? Well, the Gemara answers, as is taught, prior to the time when the Jewish people entered the land of Israel, all lands were deemed fit for songs of praise to be recited for the miracles. But after they entered the land of Israel, so after the Exodus, they wandered for 40 years and they entered the land of Israel. After that time, you can't any longer experience a miracle outside the land of Israel and then institute songs of praise to be recited for it. And it goes on for a little bit, but I thought that was kind of interesting, the logic there.
Jacob,
Uh-huh.
I'm kind of a little bit lost because we were screwing around and stuff.
Oh yeah.
Where are we right now in Deuteronomy?
We're in Talmud Tractate Megillah. We're still talking about verse 2 of chapter 4 of Deuteronomy.
Oh, okay.
And we're talking about adding commandments to the Torah. And Tractate Megillah, they have a discussion about why it's okay that they added the commandment to read the scroll of Esther every Purim, which is a requirement for Orthodox Jews. Now Ramban goes on to quote from Talmud Yerushalmi. This is the other Talmud. We were just in Talmud Bavli. Now we're in Talmud Yerushalmi. Talmud Yerushalmi, also in Tractate Megillah, but the tractates for both Talmuds are called the same, although they don't both have all the tractates. They're called after the orders of the Mishnah, or the not the orders. They're called after the Mishnahs. Anyway, Talmud Yerushalmi says 85 elders, among whom there were several prophets, were troubled by this matter. For they said, it is written, Leviticus 27:34, these are the commandments that Hashem commanded Moses, implying these are the commandments that were commanded through the mouth of Moses. And no other prophet will introduce any new thing to you in the future. Yet Mordecai and Esther wished to introduce a new matter to us, and they did not budge from that place, discussing the matter until the Holy One, blessed is He, enlightened their eyes. I don't have Yerushalmi, so I can't tell you what the solution to the problem ended up being. But the interesting part there, there's two interesting parts. One is that the assumption was that they were not allowed to add this commandment until God revealed to them why it was okay. And the second interesting thing is that they deduced it from a different verse. They didn't deduce it from this verse, Deuteronomy 4:2. That would be the one that you would think they would go for.
It really is good.
You would think that because it's obvious, it says here, don't add to the commandments. But instead, they went to Leviticus 27:34. These are the commandments that Hashem commanded Moses. How is that Well, that commandment is specific. 27:34, Leviticus 27:34 intimates that another prophet cannot come to add commandments to the Torah. This verse we're in here, Deuteronomy 4:2, indicates that someone who's not a prophet also cannot come to add commandments to the Torah. Or you could read it the other way. This commandment indicates no one is allowed to add a commandment to the Torah, whereas Leviticus 27:34 says even a prophet is not allowed to add commandments to the Torah. Now, we're very familiar with the fact that there are many practices among Orthodox Judaism that are not optional. However, we don't find them in the Torah. But Ramban addresses this. He says, what the sages instituted as a fence, right, from the beginning of Pirkei Avot, the Great Assembly commanded three things. One of them was to build a fence around the Torah, to make extra ordinances in order that it would be harder to break a commandment. Guardrails in front of the guardrails. Make sure you don't accidentally fall into the pit with the tigers in it of the zoo. And this is okay. Adding extra commandments like this, extra rules, extra prohibitions, to make it to push people further away from the laws, breaking the laws of the Torah. These kind of fences or guardrails are not forbidden. On the contrary, Raman says these are, to do so is actually a mitzvah. This is derived from Leviticus 18:30. You shall safeguard my charge, which is interpreted in the Talmud to mean make safeguards to protect my charges. But the caveat is, if you're going to add stuff like this, you have to make sure that you recognize that they are not commandments from the Torah. You have to distinguish between rabbinic commandments or customs and Torah commandments on the other hand. And the Talmud is very careful to do so, and all the commentators are very careful to do so. Well, Rashi's not always this careful. But Ramban's very careful to point out wherever Rashi's not careful. So collectively, the Jewish tradition is very careful to distinguish between a rabbinic commandment and a Torah commandment, such that it is not considered to be adding commandments to the Torah. All right, verse 3. Your eyes have seen what Hashem did with Baal Peor. For every man that followed Baal Peor, Hashem your God destroyed him from your midst. But you who cling to Hashem your God, you are all alive today. So Ramban indicates sort of why this is here. He says, now that Moses is warned against adding or subtracting from the commandments in general, Moses comes to caution them about the details of the individual commandments, and he begins with the prohibition against worshiping false gods, for that is the root of all the other commandments. Not worshiping other gods is the root of all the negative commandments, Maimonides would say. Acknowledgement of God is the root of the positive commandments. But they're kind of two sides of the same coin. Not completely, but you can see how they're sort of parallel. Verse 5, see, I taught you decrees and judgments, as Hashem my God has commanded me, to do so in the midst of the land to which you come to possess it. So there's a question here. Moses seems to be getting ready to tell people a bunch of stuff. He doesn't seem to be wrapping up something. The whole book of Deuteronomy kind of is, but he's just getting started here. Seems like a weird place to put this past tense, I have taught you decrees and judgments. Most commentators, I think, and Ramban is one of them, says that this is looking toward the future. He's saying I've taught, but what he means is, see, I'm teaching you right now. So he's really pointing forward to the things he's about to say. Alternatively, he could be saying I've taught, because he mentions to do so in the midst of the land. Right here in verse 5, he says to do so in the midst of the land. And he's saying once you get in there, all of the stuff I will have taught you will be in the past tense. But this is really actually the moment I was preparing you for, to obey the commandments in the land. We'll get to that again in a second. Why does Moses mention only decrees and judgments here? Well, he's going to go through everything in Deuteronomy. He's not only going to go through decrees and judgments. And even if you look in the past, he hasn't just taught decrees and judgments. There's several words for different types of commandments. Decrees and judgments, if you take them in the more specific sense, is only talking about some of these commandments. So why is he emphasizing these two types of commandments? Well, decrees are the type of commandment for which God does not reveal the reason. The decree is a type of commandment for which God does not reveal a reason.
Right.
So, God says, wear tzitzis in order that you may see them and they'll remind you of the commandments. And he says, do not murder. And the rabbis take the position that a rational person can figure out there's an obvious reason why we are not allowed to murder people. However, it's not clear why Jewish people are not allowed to eat pork, for example. Maybe there is a reason, and people have speculated different reasons, but the point is God never revealed a reason. He never said it was healthy to not eat pork. Even if that is the case, God has not revealed the reason. So that's a decree. It's
Just do it.
just because I said so, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Judgments is a reference to the types of laws for which a judgment may come against a defendant. For example, adjudication of monetary laws. This seems to be what Ramban sees this as referring to. If you have a judgment against you because you owe someone some money, that situation is encompassed by the term judgments here. Ramban says these two types of laws are the toughest ones for people to swallow. Decrees, because they want to have a rational reason for everything they do, and judgments, because no one wants to be told by a court that they owe money to someone else. You don't want to lose on Judge Judy. You want to win. And if you lose, you might think, well, I don't believe in Judge Judy anymore. So that requires extra exhortation that people would be careful of decrees and judgments. Ramban says, through judgments, the world is upheld. If we were all allowed to just plunder each other, we would not have a civilization. What is this doing so in the midst of the land? I mean, I know that they're about to get into the land. Maybe that's it. I mean, Ramban says there are many decrees and some judgments that don't apply outside the land of Israel. But it could be more than that. He may be alluding to the fact that the primary fulfillment of all the commandments is in the land. Not only, we know that outside the land only personal mitzvos, or mitzvos of personal obligation, are in effect, meaning that laws of regarding what you do in the temple obviously don't apply, but even laws of agriculture don't apply outside the land of Israel. But on a deeper level, even the personal mitzvahs of personal obligation, if you remember when we went through Ramban to Leviticus 18:25, he said there that even the personal mitzvahs of personal obligation, he says, be outstanding with the commandments so that when you return, they will not be new to you. Right? That's a very odd way to put it. It doesn't say be outstanding with the commandments because everything you do counts outside the land just as much. It doesn't say that. It actually seems to say the opposite. It says be outstanding with the commandments when you're not in Israel, so that when you get back to Israel, you won't be out of practice. The primary fulfillment of all the commandments is only in the land of Israel. And an example that Ramban invokes on this, and we've talked about this before, but it's worth reminding, so we can understand what he's saying about this verse here, Deuteronomy 4:5. The example he uses, I also would have written that in Genesis, actually. But Jacob married two sisters. You're not allowed to marry two sisters. It's a Torah commandment. So, according to the Chazal, the forefathers obeyed the Torah commandments, even though the Torah didn't come until Exodus, till the time of Moses. That the patriarchs still kept the Torah. So why did Jacob marry two sisters? Something's wrong with that. But then when you look at what happened, as Jacob gets to the border of the land of Israel, his second wife dies. So before he can fully enter the land of Israel, he has to only be married to one of the sisters. And in honor of Rachel, she made it to the land of Israel. And in honor of Jacob, she died before she could go in to the land of Israel, before she could cross the border. So that he would not have broken the Torah commandment not to marry two sisters. So there is a sense in which those commandments are deeply connected to residents in the land of Israel. It's an interesting idea. It's deep and probably would require further discussion, but I don't know anything more about it. So verse 6, you shall safeguard and perform them, for it is your wisdom and discernment in the eyes of the peoples. You shall hear all these decrees, and who shall say, surely a wise and discerning people is this great nation, for which is a great nation that has a God who is close to it, as is Hashem, our God, whenever we call to him. And which is a great nation that has righteous decrees and ordinances, such as this entire Torah that I place before you this day. Ramban says, through the decrees and judgments, there are great benefits. They're a source of glory and admiration from other people. Even their enemies would praise them. And even a greater benefit is that God would be close to them whenever they would call to him. The nations would contemplate this and realize that the decrees are performed because of their wisdom and discernment in order to become close to God. Decrees and judgments themselves are righteous and fair and good for the well-being of people and nations. Now, verse 9 is a source of some contention. Verse 9 says, only beware for yourself and greatly beware for your soul, lest you forget the things that your eyes have beheld, and lest they be removed from your heart all the days of your life, and make them known to your children and your children's children, the day that you stood before Hashem your God at Horeb. And Hashem said to me, gather the people to me, and I shall let them hear my words. So they shall learn to fear me all the days they live on earth, and they shall teach their children. Beware for yourself and greatly beware for your soul, lest you forget. Now Rashi says, this is just the opposite of what was just said. If you hear all the decrees and you do them, everyone else will say, well, that's what a wise people, and you'll be close to God. Rashi says, well, if you don't, if you forget them, you'll be considered fools. So if you keep the commandments, other people will think you're wise. If you don't, other people will consider you foolish. Ramban says this is not sound at all. And the reason seems to be that this exhortation of beware for yourself and greatly beware for your soul seems to be a little bit strong for something that's not a commandment. It looks like a commandment. Now, this law is not found in, for example, Maimonides' list of 613 commandments. Ramban thinks that it should be included. And in fact, when Ramban listed his 613, did he list the 613 or just criticize Rambam's? I don't know. But Ramban certainly thought that this should be one of the 613. It's interesting, they did that. the rabbis did not arrive at the number 613 commandments by counting all the commandments. They arrived at the number by adding the number of days in a year, 356 days, to the number of bones and organs that they thought were in the human body, which is 248. That's not 356, it's 355. How many days are there in a year? I can't even remember.
365.
Yeah, 365. 366 is a leap year. It's 365 days in a year plus 248 bones and organs in the major organs in the human body makes 613 commandments. And then they had to go figure out which ones, which those were. So there's several lists of 613 commandments, and they're not all the same. Generally, the one you see is Maimonides' list. But Ramban is taking a dissenting view to that list. He says this verse is a negative commandment, concerning which Moses exhorted the people greatly. For having said that we must be careful concerning all the commandments, that we should observe the decrees and the judgments to do them in the land, Moses said further, greatly beware for your soul very, very much to remember from where these commandments came to you. Right? He's not saying forget the commandments. He's saying don't forget where they came from. The day that you stood before Hashem, the thunder and the flames, his glory and his greatness, the words you heard from the midst of the fire. The commandment is to make those things known to your children and your children's children forever. God made that assembly, Ramban says, so that you shall learn to fear him all the days, and you shall teach your children for all generations. That's why the events at Mount Sinai were miraculous in the first place, to demonstrate that the commandments have a supernal origin. So before Moses gets into the next thing he's going to talk about, which is that he's going to restate the Ten Commandments, is the next sort of next big thing on the menu here. He gives this warning through this beware lest you forget, that the people should not forget anything of that assembly, do not remove it from your hearts forever, and then make it known to your children, your descendants from generation to generation, all of the children that you observed at the mountain with the seeing with the hearing. Ramban says the benefit of this commandment is very great. For if the words of Torah had come to us from the mouth of Moses alone, even though his prophetic capability was verified through signs and wonders, what if another prophet shows up? Isn't one prophet just as good as another prophet? You might doubt in your heart, especially if he can do miracles. Now, however, that at Mount Sinai the Torah reached our ears from the mouth of the All-Powerful, and our own eyes saw with no intermediary, we can contradict anyone who argues or casts doubt on it. We can prove him false. So even if you can do miracles, it's not as good as seeing what God did at Sinai without even a prophet being, not even through a prophet. They encountered God in some sense with their senses directly. This is the meaning of what God said to Moses in Exodus 19:9. Behold, I come to you in the thickness of the cloud, so that the people will hear as I speak to you, and they will also believe in you forever. For when we transmit the matter to our children, they will know that the matter is true without doubt, as if they saw it themselves. For we would not give false testimony to our children, nor would we bequeath them with words that are worthless foolishness. And they will not doubt our testimony that we tell them at all, but will believe with certainty that all of us saw with our own eyes that we are what we related to them. This idea will come up again in a passage in Deuteronomy 13. If there should stand up in your midst a prophet or dreamer of dreams. And maybe Ramban will comment further on it there. Verse 11, so you approached and stood at the foot of the mountain, and the mountain was burning with fire up to the heart of heaven, darkness, cloud, and thick cloud. Hashem spoke to you from the midst of the fire. You were hearing the sound of words, but you were not seeing a likeness, only a sound. He told you of his covenant that he commanded you to observe, the 10 declarations, Devarim, 10 words, 10 commandments. He inscribed them on 2 stone tablets, Hashem commanded me at that time to teach you decrees and ordinances that you should perform them in the land to which you cross to possess it. Hashem spoke to you from the midst of the fire. Ramban says they heard the speech of Hashem from the midst of the fire. They saw his great fire, and they achieved a perception of it. And God's covenant through the Ten Commandments was told to them in this way. For regarding all 10 of them, they heard the voice of God from the midst of the fire. According to Ramban, they didn't understand all of them, but they did hear all 10. And at the time, he commanded me to teach you the other commandments, is what he's saying here in verse 14. Not just 10. So at the time, God told me to give you the rest of them too. Because by that time, you had every reason to believe that I was a legitimate prophet. Verse 15, but you shall greatly beware for your souls, for you did not see any likeness on the day Hashem spoke to you at Horeb from the midst of the fire. So, Rambam says Moses is warning them lest they stray after the voice that they heard at Sinai and act corruptly to cut off saplings. This is a quote from the Gemara, from Talmud Tractate Chagiga 14b. And there we had the story, which we've gone over many times, of 4 rabbis who entered the garden. Maybe I'll just go there and read it. The William Davidson Talmud's online. It's easy to find stuff now. Actually, is this a different story? Yeah, no, it's there. The sages taught 4 entered the orchard, which is, this idea is somehow they were able to come in contact with the deepest secrets or the loftiest secrets of the Torah. And they're as follows. It may be a more mystical idea than that. It may be that they actually, it just says they entered the orchard. It sounds like they ascended to some level of heaven. There's different interpretations of what that means. But it's 4 entered the orchard. Here as follows: Ben Azai, Ben Koma, Acher, and Rabbi Akiva. Ben Azai died. Ben Zoma lost his mind. Acher chopped down saplings, or cut the shoots of saplings, or mutilated the shoots. It's translated in different ways. What it means, though, is that he became a heretic, and Rabbi Akiva came out safely. What does it mean to cut off saplings? It means to become a heretic. Specifically, if you sort of read between the lines, it seems to indicate the heresy is to think that there's more than one God, or to think, honestly, it seems it's probably at least in part a warning against Christianity, the idea that Jesus is sort of the same God, but sort of like also God. The Trinity says it's one, but it looks like it's also 3. Judaism has never accepted that that's a possibility, and it would regard that as this type of heresy. What did Acher see? I don't know if it's in the same passage or if it's somewhere else, but I seem to remember he saw Metatron sitting to write, and he thought, only God is allowed to sit down in the throne room, so there must be 2 of them. Yeah, it's there. It's the same tractate. So, maybe Acher did see something, and maybe he saw, maybe there is someone who's allowed to sit in the throne room. He just didn't recognize what was going on there. So Jesus sits at the right hand of the Father. But Ramban here is making this reference because this is what Moses is talking about here is beware, you didn't see anything, you didn't see any likeness when God spoke to you at Horeb. In other words, you have no reason to believe that there's two of them, like one up in heaven and one in the fire talking with you. You have no reason to sort of divide God into different parts. Or to think that there's more than one God. It's a specific type of heresy in Judaism. It's not just idolatry. All right, verse 16, lest you act corruptly and make for yourselves a carved image, a likeness of any shape, a form of a male or female, a form of any animal that is on the earth, a form of any winged bird that flies in the heaven, a form of anything that creeps on the ground, a form of any fish that is in the water under the earth, unless you raise your eyes to the heaven and you see the sun, the moon, and the stars, the entire host of heaven. You be drawn astray and bow to them and worship them with Hashem your God as a portion to all the peoples under the entire heaven. But Hashem has taken you and withdrawn you from the iron crucible from Egypt to be a nation of heritage for him as this very day. So this verse 16, lest you act corruptly and make for yourselves a carved image, Rambam understands this to mean to make a carved image into a god. It doesn't mean you can't make a statue, but it means you can't make a carved image a god by worshiping it or accepting it as a god. This idea that the stars, the sun, moon, and stars are apportioned to the peoples, Ramban says, I've already explained what that means. Every nation has a star or a constellation, and above those stars or constellations are angels that are associated with them. Rambam brings the example again of Daniel chapter 10, where we find there's a minister over the kingdom of Persia and a minister over the kingdom of Greece. These are heavenly beings or supernal beings. It is because of this that the nations make for themselves gods out of those heavenly forces and worship them. So these idols, it may not be that these idols represent just nothing at all. The idol, of course, has no power, but it may represent, the danger of the idol is that it may represent a heavenly force that we're not allowed to try to contact. This idea in verse 20, Hashem has taken you and withdrawn you from the crucible, means Hashem personally superintends Israel. Israel does not have a heavenly minister. It has, for example, Michael, but Michael is not a minister in the same way that the kingdom of Persia has a minister. He's just a helpful person who, he's not like in charge of Israel. This withdrawing of the crucible is mentioned because God had to strike down the ministers of Egypt because astrologically they shouldn't have been able to leave. So there was the ministers of Egypt, their stars were in ascendance, and it should not have been possible for the children of Israel to go out. Remember, in Judaism, generally speaking, astrology is not rejected because it's incorrect. It's rejected because God can override it. The penalty for believing in astrology is the bad thing it predicts will happen to you. But if you believe in God, he can overwrite your destiny. And behold, he did all this so that you should be a nation of heritage for him, that you should be to his great name a most beloved treasure from among all the nations. Ramban just quotes Exodus 19:5 there. Verse 21. Hashem became angry with me because of you. He swore that I would not cross the Jordan and not come to the good land that Hashem your God gives you as a heritage. For I will die in this land. I am not crossing the Jordan. But you are crossing, and you shall possess this good land. Beware for yourselves lest you forget the covenant of Hashem your God that he has sealed with you. And you make for yourselves a carved image, a likeness of anything, as Hashem your God has commanded you. For Hashem your God is a consuming fire, a jealous God. What Moses is saying here that he's not going to follow them in Israel, so it's his last chance to teach them. He's not going to be able to teach them in the land. So he's saying, don't forget what I'm teaching you now. Thinking of God as a consuming fire, Ramban says, is a reference back to the fire on Mount Sinai, and this is an aspect of God, an emanation from God. It's variously called judgment or terror or strength. And sometimes Ramban will track that particular aspect of God through the Torah. It's the aspect of God that, the emanation that's referenced by most of the names of God, not the sphere of mercy, but the sphere of judgment. God's personal name, the Tetragrammaton, is the one that represents mercy. Verse 25, when you beget children and grandchildren and will have been long in the land, and you will grow corrupt and make a carved image, a likeness of anything, and you will do evil in the eyes of Hashem your God to anger him. I appoint heaven and earth this day to bear witness against you that you will surely perish quickly from the land to which you are crossing the Jordan to possess. You shall not have lengthy days upon it, for you will be destroyed. Hashem will scatter you among the nations, where Hashem will lead you. There you will serve gods, the handiwork of man, of wood and stone, which do not see, do not hear, do not eat, do not smell. Moses doesn't say if here, which is a little concerning if you're there at that time listening. It says when. When you become corrupt. Is this a prediction or a warning? There's a problem either way. If it's a warning, we have a grammatical problem. If it's a prediction, we have a problem because in Judaism, it's a given that people always have a choice. So Ramban tries to reconcile these ideas. He says the idea of the verse is, Moses mentioned and said, when you beget children and grandchildren, because of your being long in the land and because you'll be dwelling in security, perhaps you will forget God. It's not an absolute prediction. If that will happen, then I appoint heaven and earth to bear witness that you will perish quickly. Now this passage, even though it is a warning, was not stated with the expression if, and the reason is that Moses is speaking like one who is prophesying about what will happen. And thus he speaks with a mode of speech that can be construed in two different ways. It can be construed as an expression of warning and as an expression of prophecy. But he did not decree that it must happen. It's because of this peculiar formulation that our sages of blessed memory, so that Moses alluded to the exile of the first temple and the word, was it V'noshatem? Or is it V'noshtem? I can't remember if the schwa is silent or not. But the word is the one translated, and you will have been long, which is hilarious, about one letter per word there in the translation. The numerical value of that word is 852. And it was 852 years after the Israelites entered Israel that the exile began. Or it was supposed to. And God made it 2 years early out of mercy. So to end their sin before it got too bad, I think. Anyway, the numerical value of one of the words in this passage is the number of years from entering Israel to the time of the first exile beginning. There was a hint that they didn't get until after the fact, which I think is the case for a lot of prophecies. People are always saying that it's going to happen in the future based on how they think Revelation is, Daniel or Isaiah or Ezekiel. I think a lot of those are hints we're only going to get after the fact, or maybe while it's happening. People have just been wrong about those timetables so many times. All right. Ramban says in verse 27, where it says you'll be left few in number, Ramban says it doesn't mean total. It means that each nation will have a few, but there will still be a lot of Jewish people. There you will serve gods. It doesn't bode well. It seems to be saying that they would commit idolatry in exile. But there's different explanations of this. Rashi said it means, well, you're going to be serving people who worship false gods, so it's kind of like you're serving those gods. Ramban says it's more mystical than that. If anyone who lives outside the land of Israel is as if he worships false gods. That's from the Talmud. Even if you don't do so literally, you put yourself under the domain of other heavenly powers. You're not under God's direct jurisdiction. God might can easily decide to deal with you through sending a command to a subordinate. And the subordinate, maybe is not good. All right. The meaning of what it says, these gods do not see, do not hear, do not eat, and do not smell. Ramban says this is to say that they are silent stone, just like before they are made into an idol, which is the same. They're not even as alive as a person, much less gods. For at first he said, which do not see and do not hear, by which he meant to say that the God can't see the afflictions of its worshippers and cannot hear their prayer. Then he went on to say that even lesser signs of life, like eating and smelling, like a person, a human, they don't even have that. Alternately, all four aspects mean to contrast idols with the real God, which they can't do anything. They can't eat. They can't smell the satisfying aromas of the sacrifices offered to them, and they cannot eat the sacrifices by sending forth fire. Ramban ends by saying they don't have any senses at all. If it's made of rock, it's just a rock. Verse 29, from there you will seek Hashem your God, and you will find him if you search for him with all your heart and all your soul. When you're in distress and all these things have befallen you, at the end of days you will return unto Hashem your God and hearken to his voice. For Hashem your God is a merciful God. He will not abandon you nor destroy you, and he will not forget the covenant of your forefathers that he swore to you. Ramban says this is an allusion to the redemption from exile in Babylonia. Babylonian exile. This is why he promised he would not destroy them and would not forget the covenant. Just as he said, I will remember my covenant with Jacob. Leviticus 26:42, which certainly refers to the Babylonian exile. Now, Moses will allude to the future deliverance, but he doesn't do that until Deuteronomy 20, or till the end of Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy 28, I think. So even though it says end of days here, Ramban says this is the Babylonian exile. This exile doesn't get prophesied about until the end of Deuteronomy.
So is he predicting then the Babylonian exile in 28? I mean, is that prophecy?
He's predicting.
Is that what you mean?
So Ramban says that this whole passage, starting in Deuteronomy 25, about going into exile, it looks like a prophecy, but it's actually a warning.
Oh,
But
okay.
he says verse 29 is talking about the redemption. Now, we know both of those things, the exile and redemption, did happen. So could we take them as prophecies now? Maybe, but probably not for Ramban. Even this redemption verse 29, it says, you will seek Hashem your God and you will find him if you search for him with all your heart.
Yeah.
So,
Right. Huh. So if would have obeyed, none of that would be happening with them.
yeah, there was always a choice to do better, to be obedient, and the exile was not. According to Rambam, and according to most, Judaism believes that people have the ability to choose. The Torah, if you just read the Torah plainly, God says, I put for your choice, life and death, choose life. And it seems clear that we are, we have this input into what our outcome is going to be because we are able to choose to do right or wrong.
Yeah.
Verse 32, for inquire now regarding the early days that preceded you, from the day when God created man on the earth, and from one end of heaven to the other end of heaven. Has there ever been anything like this great thing, or has anything like it been heard? Has people ever heard the voice of God speaking from the midst of the fire as you've heard and survived? Or has any God ever miraculously come to take for himself a nation from amidst a nation, with challenges, with signs, and with wonders, and with war, and with a strong hand, and with an outstretched arm, and with greatly awesome deeds, such as everything that Hashem your God did for you in Egypt before your eyes? You've been shown in order to know that Hashem, he is the God, there is none beside him. In heaven he caused you to hear his voice in order to teach you, and on earth he showed you his great fire, and you heard his words from the midst of the fire, because he loved your forefathers, and he chose his offspring after him. He took you out before himself with his great strength from Egypt, to drive away from before you nations that are greater and mightier than you, to give you their land as an inheritance, as this very day. You shall know this day and take to your heart that Hashem is the God, in heaven above and on the earth below there is none other. That verse made it into Aleinu, I think. One of the prayers that's prayed 3 times a day. You shall observe his decrees and his commandments that I command you this day, so that it will be good for you and for your children after you, and so that you will prolong your days on the land that Hashem your God gives you for all the days. Then Moses set aside 3 cities on the other side of the Jordan toward the rising sun. That seems like an interruption. What is this? Even Ezra thought that this is saying that, well, this is indicating when chapter 5 happens. This verse 41 we've ended a whole narrative here and we're getting a new one, and we're getting told when that starts. It starts when Moses set aside 3 cities to be cities of refuge. Rambam says no, actually Moses has said all the things he's said up to now, and as soon as he finishes saying that it's good to obey the commandments, he says, now I'm going to be a good example for you, and we're going to do a commandment right now, because God commanded us to designate cities of refuge. So if there's a commandment in your hand, you should do it right away. And since we have the opportunity, we'll designate the cities. Rambam notes these cities are not actually going to be cities of refuge until the 3 cities on the west side of the Jordan are also designated. But because they had an opportunity, the mitzvahs come into their hands, they shall fulfill it. It's an important principle in Judaism. You don't wait to fulfill a mitzvah. If you can do it now, do it now. There's a drash about the word mitzvah and the word chametz, which is actually very similar. If you rearrange the letters and change the hay for a chet. Chametz is of course a leaven, right? And when is bread considered to be leavened? If it sits for, I don't know, it's like 14 minutes or something, 17 minutes. So it's not a very long time for it to become chametz. And so if you let that mitzvah go, if you say, I could do that now, but I'll wait until later, it's very possible that even in just a short time, that mitzvah will become chametz, become leaven. You won't have the opportunity to do the mitzvah anymore. So Moses says, I'm going to set the example and do this mitzvah, setting aside cities of refuge right away. All right, well, next week we'll get into chapter 5. We'll get into the second, the second reciting of the 10 Commandments. Ramban will go over all the differences between the two lists of 10 Commandments.